Canada is a country that exists. This is of course self-evident to us now, but during the early days of American independence, the US openly coveted the rest of British North America, and had plenty of tensions with the British Empire. From the wars with Native Americans in the Northwest Territory that would earn British support, to the impressment of American sailors and forcing us to stop at British ports before trading with the rest of Europe. To many an American, the British Empire remained a threat to the Union despite independence. As a result, in 1812, the US would declare war on the British, citing the impressment debacle. Of course, the British Prime Minister had already withdrawn the last of those laws, but news traveled slow, and we'd already invaded Canada when we found out. The subsequent War of 1812 was a turning point for the US and Canada, solidifying the national identities of both, as well as their political separation. However, it was ultimately considered inconclusive. The US didn't get Canada, but all of their other diplomatic goals, such as the end of British support for Native Americans, were obtained. This, of course, begs the question, what if the US won the War of 1812 and took over Canada? Now, there's a few ways to go about this. Hell, even just taking Isaac Brock out of the picture seems likely to do it, since he was one of the few who was committed to preparing Canadian defenses. However, my chosen point of divergence will be that the US wins the Battle of Stony Creek. This was a surprise attack during the night, after the US had taken Fort George and the British had abandoned their occupation of Fort Erie. The US would be beaten back to Fort George and wouldn't mount further operations into Upper Canada. However, by winning Stony Creek, the US is able to push in on the British forces in Upper Canada, and for the sake of the scenario, defeats them. This also completes American control of Lake Erie, meaning that Tecumseh and General Proctor will struggle out west as well. This, in turn, pushes the Union to pursue them and liberate Detroit sooner. Under these circumstances, the US would turn toward Montreal. The remains of the British forces would likely have been concentrated in Montreal, and much like in our world, it will be a tough nut to crack. However, the US is now in a position where it can siege the city. It controls the upriver lakes and has the larger army. From there, even with the relatively weak militias, the US would be able to take it. At this point, Britain would have to open negotiations. While they wouldn't like giving up British North America, which was made up of refugees from the Revolutionary War, they didn't really have the means to demand it back. In addition, their war with Napoleon is just strategically more important than dealing with the upstarts in America. As a result, the US will likely annex Canada, which, oh boy, that has consequences, for sure. But to start with, while in our timeline the British weren't too bothered by the outcome of the war, here it's an embarrassment. They've now lost twice to these vagabond Yankees, and this time they didn't just lose the rebellious colonies, they lost the remaining loyal ones. As a result, when they defeat Napoleon, which wouldn't be changed by this, then they probably play a little harder against France. Not so much that the balance of power is shifted, especially since they're the nearest great power in the event of another revolution, but enough that we know that they're unhappy. So, what happens in the US? Well, first of all, James Monroe still wins the 1816 election, and the Federalists still collapse. Both of these happened when it was a well-regarded draw, meaning that an out-and-out win, the man might honestly get the entire Electoral College. However, this also means that the Democratic Republicans split sooner. While Monroe accepted many Federalists into the Republican Party and pushed nonpartisanship, that doesn't change that the economic ideals and needs of the states are just different. In addition, the 1820 Missouri Compromise is entirely butterflied. As far as the South sees, the North has, at minimum, 12 Senate seats lined up between the Canadian territories. Upper-Lower Canada, the Maritimes, and then Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That, frankly, is not good for the South. As a result, if the 1820 compromise happens, the Mason-Dixon line will be pushed as far north as possible, and the northern state will be that of Upper Canada, likely just called Canada or Ontario. In fact, let's just get this out of the way now. From the 1813 treaty to the 1830s, there will be a large contingent of anti-American unrest in these occupied territories. While ultimately, I think they'd be pacified and likely assimilated, sorry Canada, this is going to be an undercurrent of any northern politics, so keep that in mind. And in Quebec, well, the US isn't going to say no to the land, so it will be annexed, but Quebec is always going to be weird. It won't be big enough to completely warp American politics like it can in Canada, but it'd still be a powerful state. For example, in the 1820s, Quebec had around 400,000 people, which, in the US at the same time, puts it in the bottom part of the top 10. Nothing to sneeze at, and it's certainly getting some level of favor, but don't expect French to become a co-official language of the US here. Though it would be more French than it is in our world, at least. Though, to be honest, I doubt that any of the Canadian states, other than, I suppose, Ontario, would be admitted before the 1830s due to the anti-American sentiment. The Maritimes could be, likely as one state of Acadia, since they're small and not super affected by the war, meaning a lot of settlement, but I'm not sure. I don't think that 1820 would be that affected as an election year, so Monroe still serves 2 terms. Acadia probably votes for John Quincy Adams since he did well in the rest of New England, but it's still kind of uncertain. What can be certain is that the South is going to go rabid for expansion, otherwise the North will soon outstrip them both in population and in the Senate. This would be happening much, much sooner than it did in our timeline. As a result, I would expect to see tensions with Mexico arise much sooner than they did in our world. The US wouldn't have a claim to any Mexican land until the 1830s, but leading men of the South would still want it. And if a Southerner managed to get into the executive mansion, then these tensions would be inflamed. By the early 1830s of our world, Texas would declare independence, but it would be a political debate in the US to admit them or not, with many upper Southerners being against it. However, here that probably doesn't happen, with the Southern caucuses being much more united to gain Senate balance in the long run. As an aside, I do think that Acadia would be a strong Whig state due to its similarities to the rest of New England, but that it wouldn't be as secure. The state of Ontario would almost wind up part of the Midwest, which I think might be the rudest thing I've said to either party, due to its peninsular core jutting into the Great Lakes to benefit from all the same resources that the rest of the Midwest had. Quebec is the most aggressively democratic state in the north due to its desire for autonomy and states' rights. Hell, it probably gets a lot of immigrants due to a long coast shared with Acadia. Regardless, I think the Mexican-American War kicks off sooner, around the 1830s when the Canadian states are actually ready to be admitted to the Union. Not under Jackson himself or even Van Buren. Actually, especially not under Van Buren. Honestly, it's kind of unknowable who, since technically Jackson's Battle of New Orleans is probably butterflied away, but his war against the Florida Seminole would probably still be enough for some level of a career. Regardless, the Mexican-American War kicks off around 1839, and the US likely takes more further south to accommodate the northern Senate seats waiting in the wings, only to find out that only Sonora and Tamaulipas would be viable slave states. Baja California is likely lumped onto a Southern California state with some level of slavery, but not a lot. This timeline's 1840s look a lot like our 1850s, but it's not one-to-one. Firstly, the South still has a lot of sway, and importantly, even if the southwestern states aren't good for slavery, they are still slave states. In addition, with room up north, there's more room for slavery in the north. This will galvanize both sides as people move into Kansas and Nebraska. However, it will be more Southerners moving into these territories. In our timeline, the northern states of Iowa and Wisconsin weren't admitted until pretty late into the 1840s, 46 and 48 respectively. Here, if Texas is admitted in the 1830s, opening up the whole Southwest for colonization, the South will fill that out faster. At least the desirable parts of SoCal, Sonora, and Tamaulipas. Those would pair up nicely with Ontario, Quebec, and Iowa, wouldn't they? Thus, colonists will start pushing north sooner. This will bring economic realities of slavery to the Great Plains, meaning that northern farmers will be fighting for any land they can get. In addition, territories will look incredibly different to accommodate these new settlement patterns. The Pacific Northwest would be highly changed by this, but we'll get there. Now, it's kind of hard to say what the election that leads to secession looks like. It's entirely plausible that the Whigs leaned into being the Northern Party more successfully, or they were able to find a more stable wing in the Upper South that didn't destroy them over slavery. Maybe the Democrats collapsed instead of the Whigs. In addition, this is still 10 years earlier than it was in our timeline, meaning that the social attitudes towards African Americans might be even worse than in 1860. Or maybe the 1850s are another decade of long compromise and sectional pain, and it's not until 1860 that the whole thing goes up in smoke anyway. For the sake of argument, we'll say that it's around 1860, but that the Whigs have barely managed to hold on. The exact front lines are difficult to say. Maybe Tennessee remains loyal, becoming an industrial railway hub like Kentucky did due to the states further south. Maybe West Virginia goes to the Confederates due to some alternate politician scandal. However, I do think that if one were to simulate 100 American civil wars, the North would win at least 60 of them. Plus, I already gave the South a win last time. It does occur to me that Quebec, being a francophone territory denied representation for decades, might consider a revolt of its own during the Civil War. However, I'm not sure how well this would go, since the Union Army does have a much easier time taking Montreal than most Confederate cities. They control the lakes and river that feed the city, Acadia would remain in the Union, and Montreal and Quebec City would basically force the state to capitulate. It's not impossible that they try, but I do think it's impossible that they win. Reconstruction likely goes pretty similarly to our timeline, honestly. The Whigs or Republicans wouldn't nominate a radical in any scenario like our 1860s or most more radical ones. It would just see the anti-slavery Democrats win, and that just means another term of painful compromises. However, this moderate is probably radicalized by the war, and the odds of them being assassinated aren't high. That said, the 1860s would probably be the first time you start seeing members of the Canadian states entering conventions or running for national office. Except Quebec. In fact, let's talk about Canadian figures in the US. Obviously, these people even existing might not happen, but let's have some fun anyway. Now, annoyingly, a lot of the early leaders of Canada were born in Britain, and thus would be highly limited in American politics, even if they did still immigrate. However, there are two potential exceptions who led the Canadian Confederation. the Quebecois John Abbott, and Charles Tupper. Now, I do think that the French-speaking Abbott would probably struggle in American national politics even in the 1860s or 70s, in part because he's probably seen as too close to Catholics, but Tupper has potential. With the start as the Premier of the Maritimes, here that would be the Governor of Arcadia, he would be in a good position as a New England politician. Now, in our timeline, he was worried about an invasion of Canada by the Union while still fearing that his province would be stifled by federal overreach. That fear of invasion obviously doesn't really make sense here. However, with his inclination against Confederation overreach, he might start as a Democrat. That said, when he became Prime Minister in the 1890s, he was committed to non-denominational tax-funded schooling, tariffs to protect Canadian industry, and nationalism. Thus, he would fit right in with the Whigs or Republicans of the era. Technically, he believed that since Quebec had been promised the right to Catholic schools, then the Confederation shouldn't get involved, but here that probably isn't really brought to the court. In our world, his premiership was laughably short due to a divided party, but unless he dies after the 1892 election, that wouldn't happen. Though he would still be a lame duck afterward. In addition, Ontario probably becomes a powerhouse in the Gilded Age. While obviously it was a strong province for Canadian industry in our timeline, and is no slouch worldwide, here, the US literally cannot put tariffs on it, while cutting through the Great Lakes almost certainly means going through an Ontarian port in some capacity. It would be just as important to the US as Ohio or New York are in both this world and in ours. In fact, Oliver Mowat, the longtime Premier of Ontario, could wind up the first Democrat elected in the aftermath of the Civil War. Since he was an ardent defender of provincial rights, was in favor of pro-democratic with a small d reforms, such as secret ballots. Maybe he even manages a constitutional amendment around the 1870s. In contrast, the Sunbelt states the South fought so hard for might struggle a bit. They have a lot of the problems that held Arizona and New Mexico back until the advent of air conditioning. And even Sonora would struggle because the Gulf of California has a southward current, pushing its export goods down into Mexico and making it hard to swing around Baja into the Pacific. Now, I'm very sorry for the quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video, please do consider subscribing for more alternate history content like it every week. Something else to keep in mind is religion. In our timeline, the US has always been, by a large majority, Protestant, and religious denominations playing a role in politics has always been pretty inconsistent. However, one thing that is consistent is that Catholics have struggled politically due to being a minority tied to immigrants and an inherited distrust from British culture. However, here, the US has a much higher percentage of Catholics for more of its history, and that will likely play into politics somewhat. It's hard to say exactly how, since each party has its own logical in-group and out-group of Catholics, but I do think that the problem would be more noticeable. It probably dies down in the 20th century due to the continued existence of these subcultures, making it more and more of a political black pill, though. Now, another region that would be heavily impacted by the conquest of Canada would be the Pacific Northwest. The region was under joint British-American occupation from the 1820s to the 1840s, when the current border was established. Though there was a war scare and many nationalist Americans really wanted all of British Columbia. As American settlers poured in, the British gradually withdrew their claims and concentrated on towns further north, like Victoria and Vancouver, BC, bolstered by the gold rush. Here, of course, those American settlers are greeted by more Americans, and they likely aren't too keen on being split into two states. Who knows, maybe it looks something like this, with the Columbia River being used as a southern border for the entire state, while most of BC and Vancouver Island are included. Side note, there would be 3 Vancouvers in this state if everything is named as it was in our timeline, but that would be a hell of a coincidence. Plus, 2 major cities sharing the same name in the same state is going to get weird even if one is massively larger. So, Vancouver, Washington is named Columbia City, because fuck Ohio, I guess. Looking outside the US a bit diplomatically, America might have more problems with Britain. While they'd still be our largest trade partner, it wouldn't be by as much since Canada doesn't count anymore. Additionally, Britain can, ironically, afford to be more bellicose since it no longer has to find support for Canada in its war plans with the US, and the UK does still have the largest navy on the planet and in the Gulf of Mexico. Tensions over the Caribbean or Hawaii could easily spill out. In fact, I even think that some form of a third Anglo-American war would be likely. Tensions would be highest in the 1850s or 1860s due to competing adventures in Hawaii, but even that could still easily go off in the 1860s to 1870s. It wasn't until the 1880s that the US launched a coup in the region that made it a protectorate. While that region was dominated by foreign businessmen and competing empires before that, the British had a certain affinity for the region they didn't have everywhere else. While it's hard to say what the war looks like, I do think that Britain likely prevents American dominance over the Pacific. At least until the Spanish-American War, if that occurs. That one's circumstantial enough, it might not. But with the Third Anglo-American War in the 1870s, the US will have very little warm regard for the British throughout the rest of the century. They might even take Venezuela's side in the 1890s dispute, or Britain might refuse their mediation due to that recent war. This, in turn, could lead to a Venezuelan-British war, which could theoretically snowball into a fourth Anglo-American war, but that seems a little drastic. So we'll say Venezuela backs down without war. However, the broader point is that the US and UK do not get along in this scenario. Now, I don't think this is going to lead to a central power US, since Germany would be just as big an asshole to the Americans as Britain is. Annoyingly, this isn't actually as big a deal as you'd think. The Royal Navy would still blockade Germany, and the US will economically still be incentivized towards a pro-Entente stance, since they're the largest trade partners, and those numbers would rise as the blockade cuts Germany off. However, the US wouldn't let itself be dragged into the level of boots on the ground, and there's no way the American president is involved in the peace treaty. However, I do think the Entente would still win in the long run. Britain might have a marginally weaker army without Canada, but they do still have all the long-term advantages of the British Empire. The longer the war goes, the more it favors Britain and France. Now, the Germany thing is a scenario unto itself, but let's stick to American politics in this timeline. First and foremost, no prohibition. It was tied to anti-German sentiment throughout the 1910s and 1920s, and without the war stoking those tensions even higher, it just wouldn't be enough to become a national priority. This probably marginally delays white women getting the right to vote, since feminist groups were tied to prohibition very heavily, but likely not by more than a year or two. This also means that the speakeasy, the underground bar with all sorts of gambling and secrecy, never really takes off. Which also means that all our fun romanticized mafiosos never really get off the ground. Sorry, Sopranos fans. In addition, I could see the US being a little less nativistic in this era. Not only because of all the goddamn Frenchies running around up north, but because without the war, the Union is going to be a little less nationalistic and xenophobic. Hell, German culture is probably still way bigger in the Midwest. In addition to the weirdness surrounding the 20s, the US's economy will also be very different. While still an undisputed industrial power giving credit to the war-torn Europeans, it will also be smaller. The US in this world didn't have to mobilize a 2 million man army, build up a massive arms industry, or anything of the sort. In addition, it also didn't sell a bunch of war bonds to prop up that federal intervention, meaning it didn't balloon to its actual 1920 size during the war. As a result, while the 20s are definitely roaring, they're not roaring as loudly. However, I do think that the consumer economy will pivot to the credit basis that it did in real life, just because people are still going to want all those fancy cars and nice suits and radio boxes. Which means a Great Depression. Yay! Going forward, the Depression recovery is nearly impossible to say for certain, but at some point the country will be more or less back on track. Now, considering that our world's 1920s saw the Democrats stuck with pretty bad candidates that lost every election from 1920 to 1932 despite the US winning World War I, it seems likely that situation happens again. Maybe not so extreme, but it would still be pretty rough. So I think that the Democrats pull off 1932, maybe under someone like Mackenzie King. King's second time as opposition leader coincided with the Depression, and he was opposed to Richard Bennett's increasing interventionism and tariffs, meaning that if he takes over during the Depression, his reforms will be much more limited. In fact, he could wind up losing 1936 due to a failure to turn the economy around while not even presenting himself as trying radical new steps to fix it. It's hard to say what this means going forward, but the Depression will sting harder for longer, and the true strength of a New Deal coalition might never materialize. However, any more analysis of American politics requires knowing what's going on in Europe. Did some kind of funny mustache man get into power and start a world war? Personally, I lean toward no. Without American mediation, France is able to work with Poland and Italy against Germany much more effectively, though Britain does still stop most of their radical plans. So I would expect France to take Alsace, the Saarland, and at least part of the Rhine. Poland is likely allowed to annex Danzig in full, as well as Polophone Prussia and little nibbles of Silesia. The reparations Germany owes would be lessened due to a reduced industrial capacity, but it's hard to say by how much. That said, Germany still likely falls into a dictatorship, but I think that it would be harder for them to get up to anything drastic. France would be more apt to stand up for itself, having actually come out of the war stronger relative to Germany, and Poland, of course, cannot abide any real appeasement. Thus, I think that if there is a World War II, it's one where France holds and Germany gets bogged down in Poland until the Soviets get up to shenanigans. Germany likely holds out until 1943 or so, but it's brought down even harder than it was in our world. However, the most important question for the US is whether Japan drags them into war. I mentioned that Britain likely took over Hawaii, but the question is, what happens to the Philippines? It's very plausible they wound up in the British sphere of influence instead of the Americans, since the Spanish-American War isn't guaranteed to have happened. This likely means no Pacific War as we recognize it. However, if they did fall into the US's orbit and there is a Pacific War, that's likely it. Germany can't take over the Benelux to get around France in the current situation, and that means Japan doesn't take Indochina. Its fight with the US over China and the Philippines would be self-contained and still end in an American victory. From here, I think the US would be dragged out of its traditional isolationism into the game of empires. However, this long 20th century will be much more like the 19th. France and Britain remain colonial powers for much longer, and Russia will be waiting in the wings to exploit their weakness, much like how it was in the 1840s and 50s. In addition, France has regained its position as the leading power of Europe, while the US is content with its traditional sphere of influence in Latin America and its new dominions over the Pacific. While the US is likely the strongest economy on the planet, it's not nearly as dominant as it was in our world. It's a first among equals to the Western powers, not an overt hegemon over the continent. From here, any details are impossible to predict, and the scenario would be almost pure fiction. However, if you want me to make a part 2 of this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.